Hey everybody, this is Rydo and we're back to another live stream of the Minigame Podcast. We'll have a bit of a warm-up section and then we'll jump into the video game news. Today is Wednesday, January 22nd. Last stream I slept in and streamed too late. Today's stream, and this seems to be fairly commonplace when this happens, I am waking up too early and streaming a little bit earlier, although perhaps not too early for most people, maybe definitely earlier than I would want to be awake, generally speaking, for myself. That being said, that probably will help with not having a long drag out warm-up section because I have been awake for a couple hours, and on these streaming days it's not like I can really do too much. Otherwise, I could have probably done some side projects for an hour or two and streamed a little bit later. Surely that would be the right move if I had a very specific time to start each stream. Although even starting a project before that point tends to then cause me to be late towards any scheduled project or release time of the live stream. So yeah, in most cases it is my theory that most people, when they have like a meeting in an office at 10 in the morning or something, they tend to spend, if not all of their time from arriving at about 6 in the morning or 8 in the morning to 10 doing very little, maybe checking a few emails, drinking coffee, just getting prepared for the meeting in general. That is my theory as to how it goes for most people, and that there isn't just a lot of room for productivity. Now, in most office jobs, actually there's very little need for productivity anyway, so people are barely doing a couple hours a day worth of actual productive activity or work. On the other hand, anytime I talk about like office jobs, a real need to point out that there is a major divide there between like blue collar and white collar work, and I might be using these phrases inaccurately, but factory line assembly workers, for what little of those still exist in the United States, they tend to actually be working almost 100% of the time in their jobs, if not often over 100% due to overtime, often forced overtime. And there definitely are jobs that are assembled that way. If you're at a busy McDonald's, I imagine you are working most of the time. If you're working at a Walmart, I imagine you are working most of the time. It really is when you're in a sit-down office type environment, when you're slightly better types of jobs. And those used to be middle-class jobs back when there was a middle class, but in reality they are just slightly different jobs that still underpay drastically. And of course, I'm talking about associate level office jobs and lower management level office jobs. When you get to CEO level and C-suite level office jobs, those people are not really working at all for the most part, or they're making very broad sweeping decisions based on a couple of meetings, and that's it, often making horrifically terrible for the rest of society broad sweeping decisions. And yeah, I guess I won't want to get into too much of a rant today. There is a huge opportunity for all kinds of semi-political and political rants today that I'm going to try my best to avoid with the new United States administration being enacted and doing pretty much everything they promised to do on day one, doing quite a lot of executive orders. But yeah, so far, none of it has inherently been specifically targeted towards video games, and so as such, I am in the enviable position to be able to not really speak on it, which is more is the better, in my opinion. Here we can see the top 100 chart for our concurrent gameplay players. Once again, I imagine very little has changed. I wouldn't be surprised if the numbers were slightly higher, particularly in the top, because of the Inauguration Day / Martin Luther King Jr. overlap holiday, federal holiday. And certainly, even I could see a reason why I would have sought out non-news, non-political news overall over these time periods, because you're just going to get a lot of it, even on an average Inauguration Day. That's going to be everything that's talked about. So if you're not interested in that, I could see turning to video games. On the other hand, if you are interested in that, you might turn away from video games. It is still, I think, overall sweepingly, kind of a disappointment that the top 100 game has only 18,000 people playing it in a 24-hour period. Which, yeah, that's weird. If you were to compare that to, say, a NFL football game, even if there are multiple NFL football games and college football games all happening on the same day, the number of teams in college football league and in a National Football League is still really only going to be into the hundreds. Maybe let's just make a number up and say 200 teams between NFL and CFL as far as the possible teams that could be playing a game. Divide that in half because they have to be playing a game against somebody else. That means in a single day, at most, there would be 100 football games on TV or in stadiums of some sort that somebody could choose to watch or play. This is ignoring people who just who are playing football themselves in local teams or just free games. But you have to take that 100 potential games one day and see how that is just an incredibly small selection compared to the selection of games that you could play on Steam, which, if you eliminate most of the irrelevant games, you're still going to be well over, I would estimate, at least 30,000 games that somebody somewhere might want to play. And that is just a way bigger selection, a way bigger tent as far as where people could put their attention to play games. The broadness of gamers as a community, if it really is a community, which I question and don't think it is, not a wholly connected community, is then further spread because within the subset of video games, you have football fans who would be playing football games, but then you also have comic book fans who might be playing Marvel Rivals, or the gamer bros who like Counter-Strike 2 in particular playing that, and then a different group of gamer bros who might like PUBG, and not that everybody who likes those games is what I would classify as a gamer bro, but it just is a very wide selection and variety there. In comparison back to the football example, there are no fantasy league football games on TV. I would be surprised if there's even one fantasy league football team in existence, even as a joke, which, now that I think of it, isn't a terrible thought, frankly. We're playing football, but it is but everybody is made up like orcs and humans and mages and wizards and things like that, which is funny because there is a video game series totally around that concept, where it takes football and puts orcs and wizards and things like that in it. Forget the name of it, but yeah, basically I'm not being as creative as I really think I am. But yeah, the genres are very, very wild. I don't know if there's a cyberpunk style football game out there. There definitely is room for it. And that's the beauty of creating things in a digital format, is that you have a lot lower barrier of entry to experiment with things and try something different and just change the visuals and skins of something. Yeah, I don't know if there's too much else as far as the warm-up section to do. I am getting fairly close to being done with decluttering the house and cleaning it. That being said, I did find that I have a leaky shut-off valve on the toilet that I need to replace, and I was going to replace a medicine cabinet and vanity light, and once I took down the existing vanity light and medicine cabinet, I found several problems that has made it necessary for me to seek out more professional help, in part because I know that there's at least one, probably two, air vent tubes in the plumbing directly behind that wall. But for some insane reason, my house is built off of 24-inch apart studs, when 16 on center is the standard, and as far as I know has always been the standard in building houses. So somebody was definitely trying to save wood and got away with it. That being said, that means there is a stud exactly in the corner on the wall where the vanity cabinet should be held, and a stud slightly off center in it, and nowhere else. So it is going to necessitate, at the very least, cutting the drywall completely down. The electrical in it is also horrible, and none of the wiring is in a box, and it's definitely not to code. It's just hanging there outside of a box, no clamps on it, no stress relief, probably not stapled to wire to the walls. Has a splice in it that to move where the vanity light was. So this is at least the second time that the medicine cabinet has been replaced, which is not super surprising. But yeah, I'm gonna need somebody to have the skill and expertise to take an oscillating tool, which I don't own. I can buy it, but I don't have the skill to really use it, to cut what is going to be a fairly giant square hole in the wall, at which point cross beams in between the studs might be a thought, but more than likely I suspect I will just cut a giant hole in the wall, put particle board in there instead of drywall, which means then it would be much more rigid. The medicine cabinet was there, by the way, was hung up using drywall anchors, which it in fairness, stayed up there, but put giant holes in the wall too. So, and frankly, I don't think the drywall anchors were particularly locked into the drywall as much as they were just hanging on the edge of the drywall, past the point where they should be. Like they punched a big hole in the drywall, and then the drywall anchors were just catching the lip of the back side of the drywall, if that makes any sense. But yeah, I'm gonna need an expert, I think, to at least cut it, and then I can fix the wiring. Hopefully I can fix it so that it's on a light switch right now, and I'd like to move it around a little bit so the light switch would just turn on some but not all of the electrical things there. It will give me an opportunity to add an outlet on the other side of the wall too, which is I desperately need an outlet on the other side of the wall too. So, but yeah, I can do the electrical. Then I probably am going to need somebody to float and tape the drywall back to the edge of the particle board, and then I'll probably have somebody paint. Although the last professional quote-unquote professional I hired to paint, in fact the last two quote-unquote professionals that I had paint, didn't really do a particularly good job on it. So I'm almost approaching the point where, being surrounded by incompetence, I might just pick up the paintbrush myself and give it a try, even knowing that my shaky hands is almost certainly not going to do any better. But yeah, what was supposed to be a fairly easy job of just taking down one medicine cabinet and vanity, and then finding that there was a proper wiring and box to change the vanity light out to and attach it to, and that there would be proper studs somewhere I could find to hang up the medicine cabinet, has turned into a much more complicated process. Even if it was just 24 off center and the studs were somewhere in the middle, then that would have still worked, because it is just a metal backed medicine cabinet. I could have taken metal drill bits that I have and drilled new holes to mount at 24 inch. But yeah, the only other possibility would have been to put pieces of wood in front of the drywall, and then that would not really, then the thing would not be flush, and it would just look ugly that way. And otherwise, I guess the only other thing I've been doing, other than watching a few streaming services, I'm still watching the anime Fire Force second season. It starts off very fan servicey, like a completely different team is in charge of it. Slowly now, I think they are moving into telling some kind of story. It definitely feels like the second season is an almost completely different story than the first season was, which barely was a setup. And the first season in particular, I think, could have done really well to be a lot slower and just establish the world and the characters, and not get as kind of silly with the characters as fast as it goes. It kind of has that Bleach problem where every episode in the first season they're introducing a new wild and crazy character with wild and crazy abilities, where it would have probably been better if they'd just introduced some lower level, fairly normal people. let's see. I've been watching this Showtime series called The Hunger that's on Amazon Prime that I have to fully admit it's a Skinemax series that clearly had the mandate to have at least one softcore sex scene in it in every episode. And they integrated that enough that the series couldn't have been edited out for just basic cable broadcast. But it's an interesting twist in a sci-fi monster of the week type story, in that it does have that high level of Skinemax into it, which is by modern standards fairly quaint. Like, you're just seeing fairly old people's, by today's standards, boobs, and that's about it. The second season, there's a host for this anthology series, each episode standing alone. The second season is hosted by David Bowie, which was really shocking, and I suppose that's where some of its prominence that it was claiming to have in the description comes from. It is fairly interesting to see David Bowie do anything these days, or have done anything. And I would say the second season does seem to be a little bit more modern, almost like the second season may have been several years after the first season, in that there's more LGBTQ plus type representation in the romances, where the first episodes of the first season were very much it's a guy, it's a girl, it's written and shot from a male perspective in the male gaze, as much as possible. It comes off, the first few episodes of The Hunger come off fairly sleazy and fairly trashy, things that you would expect where a show like that would have been greenlit, whereas second season kind of starts to evolve it, and you start to see females being the protagonist and females being the empowered ones in a lot of stories. Now, weirdly, I'd say by modern standards, though, it's still not particularly progressive, because there's a lot of limitations to the series like that, which you would have figured would have had very few limitations, other than it probably can't just be hardcore. That they probably were told specifically you cannot go hardcore and show lower genitalia. But anytime there's a story that wants to delve deeper into physical violence, or simulated physical violence and masochism, the visuals start flaring up, where you can see less and less, and there's a lot more jump cuts and a lot more just kind of not blurring but pixelation effects and things like that, flashes. It's weird, to say the least, and second season in particular feels very jump cutty, and trying to look like it's artsy when it really is just censoring things. Yeah. So it's an interesting new series in a world of very few new series for me. I've either seen everything, or the recommendation algorithms on streaming services like Amazon Prime are just so terrible that they won't recommend other things. Particularly, I'm noticing that the continue watching on Amazon Prime is heavily being messed with. So something you just watched that has a new episode, well, often I'll have to go all the way to the continue watching on the right side and just scroll through many shows that I have stopped watching a long time ago, or never even started watching. But yeah. And so yeah, these algorithmic things are getting worse and worse as far as that goes. I also started watching Transparent, which I don't know if I'll really stick through it because it feels like a show that has a lot of character building and storytelling in it that I don't know if I'm in the mood to sit through that much character building and storytelling at the moment. But yeah. Let's see. And yeah, I'm still working on my side project experiment of using the Godot engine to make a presentation clock that could be used by businesses to display a clock and tweak it and customize it, but also it's going to work very nicely as a clock for the Steam Deck. Perhaps my intent on what it should be used for has shifted, and now there's more of a focus that this should be something that would be almost industry standard if it gained a following by people who have displays and signage and want a custom clock. Churches, schools, McDonald's, anything like that. This might be an open source app that gets you really far. And I'm making small strides of success there. I'm having, however, a real hard time figuring out the math of making the text stay centered, because vertically centering things the way I've got it working so far is not super easy. I can kind of get it to be centered when it starts, so you'll have the time and it will be in the center, and that'll be an option as opposed to it just starting in the top left. But it's on a horizontal slider, so as this horizontal slider can be dragged in this way, the text gets smaller and rescales itself, so it still fits in a smaller window. But because it's a smaller window, the text that once would have been here will diagonally move its way slowly up to here, because that would be the new center, and that's not what I want it to do. I want it to stay there. And I can kind of simulate that in that as I shrink this page, what was once here is now here. Yeah. And so there is a label there called a segment offset, which is something I'm going to have to read and add that to a top margin setting to keep it in the same place. Because effectively what I'm asking it to do is go lower from its vertical center as the window gets smaller and smaller. So yeah, I'm still having some programming things there, and I definitely would say the Godot engine UI has always been awful, is what I've heard from other game players in every engine. But yeah, it's not particularly good in the Godot engine from what I can tell. There's just not amazingly great ways that you can put a button down and then automatically connect that button to doing anything at all. And that's where you're really going to end up with a bunch of programming stuff. And weirdly, with the Godot engine and GD scripts, there's a lot of separation of code there that feels wrong to me. although that is certainly what has always been preached in when you're doing real projects that are big projects, is that you abstract away everything into libraries and different code sections at the very least, instead of everything happening in one text file. But yeah, inherently in Godot, it takes it to a real extreme in that you may very well have just one line of code attached to a button, and that seems kind of crazy because you may have hundreds of buttons and not a single location to look and see what all those buttons do. Although the way I'm planning on doing it is to more connect all of those buttons to just shortcuts and keys, and then have one single spot that handles whether the shortcuts or keys are pressed or whether the button is clicked. So all multiple different ways to trigger the same action, which is probably the right way to do it, but no simple solution there either. And there's definitely far fewer UI tutorials for the Godot engine than here's how you make a game tutorial, or here's a tutorial to make a simple tic-tac-toe game or snake game or something like that. And that is really the weeds that you're going to get stuck in if you're a kid or anybody learning the Godot engine, is that you may have something that looks like it's fairly close to being done because the gameplay part plays fine, but then the completely different way of designing and thinking about things as far as just how do I make a pause screen, how do I adjust the resolutions, how do I turn up the volume and things like that, those may be more difficult to figure out, since that's just not the sexy kind of tutorial that'll get views on YouTube, which inherently highlights a problem of the conflict between distributing information that's needed and distributing information that is designed to get you views, to get you monetized, to get you attention, to get you influence, whatever your reason for making a YouTube video happens to be. It very often is not a reason that is best for society. Which I guess that's the Sesame Street argument too, is that Sesame Street inherently is not that entertaining to older kids, 10-year-olds even. Sesame Street really is for like 6-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 2-year-olds. And certainly it's not going to be particularly entertainment for adults. That being said, Sesame Street is almost certainly helpful information that should be distributed and shown to kids and perhaps even a few adults. And so a Corporation for Public Broadcasting funding Sesame Street, which I'm not sure that actually the Corporation for Public Broadcasting does actually fund Sesame Street anymore or ever did, is something that's really helpful and needed. Alright, I think that's more than enough warm-up for today. We'll quickly look at my longer running chart, which at this point I am really just waiting until I find some free time to change this chart, because the long-term scale of seeing this chart is not information that I'm particularly interested in anymore, and I think shorter term perspectives may be helpful. That being said, it still probably should be longer term than the 24-hour chart of SteamDB, which is what it's competing and getting its information from. It could never actually be less shorter than SteamDB's 24 hours because 24 hours is the source of the information. But yeah, I'm thinking we'll think 4 weeks and see how that feels. See if the chart changes fairly frequently when we're looking at what is the most played games in the most recent 4 weeks. That being said, there is still a very good argument towards just blacklisting some of these games at the top who really don't matter too much. Of course, there is also an argument that could be made to not even looking at the top 100 and instead pay attention to the 101 to 200 games that have been most played, because almost all the games in the top 100 are fairly stagnant. It's just that they move around a little bit. On a rare occasion you'll get something new that will break the top 100, Marvel Rivals being an example of that. Noticeably, Marvel Rivals is not on this chart at all, and wouldn't be for many weeks. Let's see, the Real-Time Strategy Fest is still going on, and not sure that there's going to be anything else to really say about Steam. A Governors of Poker game makes it to the front page fairly often. I can't help but assume that there's just a lot of people playing it. Which, in fairness, if I really did want a card game to go along with these live streams, once again, I could see playing Governors of Poker. That being said, I'd almost certainly lose all of my free credits and then get into a problem there. And it would make the streams way longer. For no good reason. Also, having poker is potentially risky compared to playing, say, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Master Duel, or Magic the Gathering. Those games don't look like gambling as much. I don't think I've mentioned it, but I managed to finally uninstall Cardcaptor Secure Memory Key off my cell phone. Terrible game. Still claiming to be in beta according to the notes. Months later. Added nothing of importance. Did not cycle in any new content over that period that I was playing it. And even the desire to go down memory lane and experience in a different fashion these stories of Cardcaptor Sakura fell apart completely, and by the end I was just skipping the stories sections completely and just not interested at all. There are entire elements to the game that can only be purchased as far as different cloud cards, which is completely unacceptable since they were what you needed to get abilities to win fights, but then the fights are really in the story mode and the daily quest mode, and the daily quest mode ends after 28 sections. So it's not like a daily challenge, it's stories of what was going on in the daily life of Sakura, and so extremely limited. There was a ton of other things, other activities designed to just kind of waste your time in the game that really didn't matter or connect to the main gameplay mechanic. And really the main gameplay mechanic is not focused on at all, because the gacha purchasing of the terrible chibi versions of Sakura and her friends, little toy chibi dolls, was their main focus. To no real avail, even if even getting a bunch of them only led to you getting coins as a currency, one of its many currencies, which were fairly useless and not leading towards anything. I had hoped that there would have been a point there that the new content would have unlocked once doing the story mode, but no such luck. So that's my final statement, really, on Cardcaptor Sakura memory key. Just a not recommended, strongly disrecommended. If you want to get into Cardcaptor Sakura, watch the anime or read the manga if you can afford to buy the manga. You will have a much better time. Yeah, and if it is still the case that Cardcaptor Sakura is not translated and dubbed, watching Cardcaptors even wouldn't be the worst thing ever, although you really are giving yourself an inferior experience if you were watching Cardcaptors instead of Cardcaptor Sakura, since that is a out of order, severely edited version of Cardcaptor Sakura, edited in fashions to change the meaning of the story and change the protagonist, really, and just try to make it more Americanized and more kid-friendly. There isn't really any objectionable material in Cardcaptor Sakura, at least by anime standards, that would have been edited out. In fact, weirdly, I would say there's an almost Americanization of Cardcaptor Sakura in the first place, in that there just aren't a lot of Japanese things. They never really have Sakura in a bath scene. They never have her go to an onsen. They never have a beach episode. They never put her in any kind of swimwear that is inappropriate. She is supposed to be a very young girl, and they treat it very appropriately in that, but the only thing that is slightly Japanese is that she has a crush on her brother's friend. And so, but I mean, it really is just cute puppy love type stuff. Spoiler pun not intended there. But the anime series, it's one of the few ones that I really do think you could put a 8-year-old girl in front of and be perfectly happy for her to watch it. As far as animes, or even an 8-year-old boy, unfortunately there's just not enough anime like that that is kid-friendly enough and Americanized enough to really get them too much into anime. I'm still playing Memento Mori on my cell phone too. I guess I still really am doing warm-up sections until I get right into the news, aren't I? Yeah, they're continuing to add more and more content. Still playing Pokemon TCG Pocket, which the current event I question heavily whether I'm going to make it to the point of getting a medal there, with trying to get consecutive wins, considering how the cards have evolved with the latest expansion. It did finally force me to at least make a new deck, but it is crazy that there is a deck limit at all in the game, so I had to delete one of my previous decks to to make a new deck to try and get consecutive wins. And even at that, I still question whether I'm going to have enough of the right cards to win. We don't see any more refurbished Steam Decks. They do seem to come in fairly infrequent batches as far as things being available. Of course, I'm not reloading this page like every single day, multiple times an hour, so there might be 2 or 3 that pop up in stock. I do think at some point we're going to have a conversation as far as where is the right angle compared to the buttons and D-pad for an analog stick. Specifically on the Steam Deck, the touchpads are clearly in the place where analog sticks would have been on an Xbox controller. That being said, with the new Switch 2 reveal, the analog stick is very much just in a complete line this direction to the D-pad and the buttons. Well, there is no D-pad actually on the Switch 2, so just the buttons in particular would be in a complete line. So yeah, the question is, should it be about 45 degrees, or should it be, if this was 0 and this was 90, 180 degrees, or in this case that would be 270 degrees, just about, to away from this being 0, origin point. I suppose looking at a picture here of the Steam Deck also just highlights some of the clear influence that the Switch 2 has, whereas it's still kind of worth pointing out that there's a fairly large difference there depending on how big your hands are, or how big you think the inputs on a control system should be. Compared to the Switch 2, this frankly feels very busy, but in reality this might very well be the exact appropriate layout, and the Joy-Cons may still be very, very much too small for what they are. It would be, I guess, nice if there was a way to have input completely without it taking up any of the front of the screen, and that this would just be one giant screen, although it would really just be a wider, more cinematic feeling screen at that point. This is already 1280 by 800, which is still fairly widescreen compared to the Switch 1. It'll be interesting to see what the native resolutions of the Switch 2 might be, if it's any higher, but that's also still not 1920 by 1080, which is your standard TV resolution at 1080p and that 16 by 9 ratio. And it may be a very long time before we could get any kind of mobile device that does have native resolutions at 1080p. But yeah, until you have like brain interface chip circuitry, you're gonna have to have buttons of some sort. But I do think that there is potentially a rethinking of things where potentially a touchpad like this may be all you need, maybe with just little nubs on the edges, so you just kind of bump your thumb to the left or right to hit A, B, X, Y like that, instead of squishing buttons downward. Or maybe you get touchpads that are just so pressure sensitive that just generally taking the action like there was a button there lets you press A, B, X, Y. You could probably do that with the Steam Deck right now. It's just not going to feel squishy as much as you would want it to compared to pressing a button. Analog sticks still, though, feel very different from swiping or touching touchpad. So a lot of it may just come down to learning whole different systems and maybe a whole new generation of gamers using touchpads. That being said, Lenovo Legion Go doesn't have touchpads. None of the other controllers have touchpads that you use consistently. The PlayStation controller has a touchpad, but you don't use it very consistently. The Switch 2 doesn't have a touchpad. Has probably a touch screen, but that's a very different experience too. So I wanted to check out the Daedalic sale just to see what the discounts really are. Of course, I say this every time, but I really can't afford anything to be buying any games. In fact, I'd say kind of in a bad financial situation to even being. This Fading of Nicole Wilson is the sequel to The Suicide of Rachel Foster, but I didn't like the first game, so I doubt the sequel would be any more interesting. I guess they still are making Surviving Deponia. Notice how they have several coming soon games here. But yeah, really shouldn't be buying games, really shouldn't even be buying too much extra as I'm cleaning house, and part of the process of decluttering and cleaning house is finding where things are lackluster, and sometimes that does lead to buying extra things to replace things or to have them in the first place. That being said, the counter argument towards what many people's argument is, which is to never buy anything until you absolutely need it, is that you're slowly, just by small irritants on a day-to-day basis, driving yourself towards unhappiness, which, yeah, you shouldn't try very hard to not tie happiness to owning things, but inherently, if you don't have a paper towel holder, for instance, then you've just got a slightly trashier house, I guess, that either doesn't have paper towels, doesn't use them, or has just a roll of paper towels sitting on some surface somewhere, some counter. Whereas spending $10 to $20 for a paper towel holder to get it off a surface, to have it have a specific place where it goes, is definitely, in my opinion, the right move. It's something that many people won't realize. I don't think all of these games here are Daedalic games. Daedalic published games, even. Let's check Unrailed, because that one in particular I definitely don't think was a Daedalic game. But yeah, you get into a situation where you could live your whole life without a paper towel holder, certainly, but you're just going to be in a very a slightly more disorganized, wow, Daedalic Entertainment apparently is the publisher. I can't help but assume that this was a game that was owned by a different publisher or previously, and Daedalic has either grown, or Daedalic is just the name now of the publisher, in the sense that maybe Tencent was the publisher before, since I know Tencent has some ownership of Daedalic too. Blaze Blue Entropy. It's only 30% off. Spike Chunsoft. So Rain Code Plus. This is probably a game I would want to play at some point, but 40% off is not a huge discount, and But that being said, I guess it is also realistic to expect less of a discount for more of these niche Japanese games. You know, Danganronpa 2 is only 70% off, and if we were to open that, I bet SteamDB will tell me that it's never been more than 75% off, even its biggest discounts. This one's 80% off. But yeah, I wouldn't expect these more niche games to get too cheap. AI Summoning Files from 2019 is 90% off. In general, I kind of don't expect games to be on super discount as the economy, at least that might be my assumption as far as the direction the economy is going to go. I'm actually very shocked here that Steins Gate is 80% off for $11.68. That's a really good deal. That being said, it's worth pointing out that this is a visual novel series, so don't buy it unless you're aware of that. That also being said, though, that the Steins Gate, at least the first game, is considered one of the best visual novels ever made. So if you were going to get into visual novels, starting with the best is a possibility and an option. Perhaps not the suggestion I would make, though. There is definitely a mistake in setting the bar too high by reading a really good visual novel like Steins Gate and falling in love with it, and then finding that nothing else is anywhere as good, and you've just started too strong. Inherently, one of the first animes I watched when I was an edgelord teenager was Serial Experiments Lane. It was not the first, but it was one of the ones I watched in the first year or so that I was really into anime. And I had seen some things on the Sci-Fi Channel that turned out to be anime, but I didn't know that anime was a thing back then as far as the phrase and the word. I just thought it was an animated sci-fi show of some sort, sci-fi movies. Like arguably the very first anime that I remember watching was probably, what's the name of it? I'm not gonna be able to remember it. Well, one of them on the sci-fi was called Green Legend Ran, which that one I don't think ever got printed and released on DVD. There definitely were a couple of them that ran on the Sci-Fi Show that never got released at all on DVD or VHS, even in the West or in Japan themselves. Armitage the Third would have been another early one. But Serial Experiments Lane was one of the more TV series that I really watched as one of my first ones. And Serial Experiments Lane is really, really good. It's very deep-minded sci-fi series. Fairly different from most anime now or even then. And so it set a very high bar in my mind as far as other anime series that I wanted to watch. Unfortunately, it wasn't that great that that bar was set too high, and so I ended up watching a lot of other series that I enjoyed very thoroughly. But yeah, I definitely wouldn't recommend watching Serial Experiments Lane first as an anime fan, or even as a sci-fi anime fan. I would definitely say watch something more kid-friendly and start off with some Ghibli, which Ghibli in itself is very different types of anime. But yeah, My Neighbor Totoro is definitely a default recommendation to get into anime. But then there are other ones too that are more mature that would target an older audience. The show, I found it on my anime shelf over here. That's why I'm looking to the left. It may sound a little bit more. That I almost certainly watched first was called Iria, IRIA, and that was probably the first anime I ever saw. And uniquely, Iria was one of these very early anime shows that also had a live action version of it made. So some of the really, really old sci-fi shows do have that interesting take in that you can have a low budget Japanese live action version of the movie shown. Guyver is another example of that, where there's a low budget live action version of Guyver, and then there's at least one anime series of around that same time of Guyver. Of course, I'm talking about anime right now instead of video games. Today definitely feels very different. It feels like I'm warming up in a very different way, or I just have a very different level of sluggishness in my mind right now, because I'm just having a hard time getting on topic instead of having a hard time of just being alert or awake, which yeah, maybe that is part of the problem of being too early morning. But it definitely leaves me in this weird situation where I think to myself, like, what am I doing with these live streams? Because I'm just so off topic, and it is really just a ramble fest. This is definitely the kinds of stuff that I would avoid saying if I was making pre-recorded footage playing a game in focus of actually just playing a game and criticizing the content of the game and commenting on the content of the game. But yeah, we are to the videogameschronicle.com news, so I guess I have to kick myself in the butt. And in fact, I think that's not actually what I want to do, but I think what I want to do is I'm going to just take a small 5-second break here, and I'm not even going to pause the video, and I'm going to stand up and just walk around and try and refresh myself. So I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back. That turned into slightly longer of a walk around and resettle myself break, but not too long. So yeah, let's go through the Video Games Chronicle news. I will say my macro kind of worked today, which it is still very weird that some days it will completely not work, some days it'll kind of work. Unfortunately, not very consistently do I get days when it completely works. I will also say when we get to GameDeveloper.com news, I really am just questioning whether there is a lot more reason to continue to follow them, because they aren't even really putting out articles consistently enough to have something, a single new news story every time I stream. They may very well just become infrequent, and at a certain point I may just start closing the interstitial tabs like this for GameDeveloper.com if there's just not any news. We do have Gaming on Linux as our newest news source to replace it though, so that's pretty fine. Moving on to Video Games Chronicle. I saw the headline here, and this one definitely inspires a reaction in me. The PlayStation 5 dinosaur horror game is skipping a PC release to avoid, quote, sexualized mods. Team Kill Media explains why its spiritual successor to Dino Crisis isn't coming to PC. This game is called Code Violent, just so we can know the name of it. Code Violet, not Violent Purple. Inherently, I think there's several different things that you can I want to go back. I guess just rewatch this entire thing. I don't know why it started at the end there. Several different things you can speculate on this with. One, first of all, this trailer is starting with showing off feet. So, knowing how the internet has at least connected a fairly small community of feet fetishists together, enough that most celebrities are told and actively go out of their way not to show their feet. People go out of their way to not show their feet. It's interesting for a game to start that way. So on the first spot, I would say, this being a PlayStation game, I suspect PlayStation is funding the publishing of this game, and inherently, I suspect that the real case here is that they don't want to put out a PC version in the exact same launch window as the PlayStation version. That being said, you're painting yourself in a very odd corner with this excuse, which I can only call it an excuse. This female character here also definitely feels somewhat sexualized. I mean, you look at this trailer from this perspective. I haven't seen characters being close to kissing in a video game trailer, I think, ever. And then inherently you're looking at this trailer and the main protagonist is zoomed out. The main camera from the third person perspective is zoomed out in a way to definitely show the butt of the main character, and this character definitely is wearing a skin tight cat suit and has a very prominent butt. So there's just like a ton of stuff there. I need to go back here just a little bit. I'm going to pause something else to show here. There's a ton of sexualization here and there in this trailer. Did I miss it? looking for a little bit of white text that popped up here at the bottom. So here we go. Can't see it, can you? Okay, here. Footage captured on a PC, not all images appear in game, is what it says. So it's funny to have that disclaimer and then say the game is not coming to PC at all. But yeah, this may be potentially the new excuse that games that are being published on PlayStation use, is to say that they're avoiding sexualized mods or nude mods being added to their game. It's also, I suppose, slightly worth mentioning that Reddit seems to have been brought to a point where they are, each subreddit individually is starting to decide that they are going to block Twitter/X tweets being linked. So Reddit's putting each subreddit individually is being inspired by other subreddits to potentially choke off a lot of interconnection with tweets and such. So Twitter may find itself to be even less relevant in a fairly short amount of time than it has been in recent past few months, where a lot of people had already left Twitter for Blue Sky. And I would say it still does seem like Reddit has a decent amount of power as far as forming what your average person sees on the internet. So that very well could be impactful. But yeah. The exact quote here is, "The reason we are not bringing it to PC is we do not want any modding vulgar versions of our main character as well as other characters in the game." Which, yeah. That, to me, feels like an excuse for one or two reasons. Either PlayStation has paid for exclusivity, or Team Kill doesn't want to spend the money or doesn't have the skill to release it to PC. Which in modern days, it really shouldn't be that hard to release a PC version. That being said, supporting programs, PC versions, is a little bit more work. Yeah. If you've made your game specifically to only run on PlayStation style hardware, handling other kinds of NVIDIA chips, GPUs, or AMD or Intel CPUs, things like that might affect performance a little bit. Your games would probably run on different hardware fine, just not as smoothly or look as nicely. Notice here, though, that I'm not putting any sincerity to this excuse at all. I just don't believe that that's the real reason. That they actually are, for some reason, so protective of this new protagonist character that they would actively hurt their sales and hurt the potential adoption of this as a new potential series. And yeah, that just feels like cutting off your nose to spite your face, if that really was what they were doing. And I can't really believe it is the case when you've got your main protagonist already fairly sexualized. If it were the case, I guess, that you had a character that you've gone out of your way to not make particularly attractive, maybe I would believe that, but it would have to be so unattractive that it would look like something from like Big Mouth. And even the explanation of why the characters look so ugly in Big Mouth is because they actively didn't want those fictionalized animated kids to ever be sexualized. I mean, even that really just feels like you're an excuse, and it's just made Big Mouth characters look really, really ugly for not much of a good reason. And inherently, this is decades and decades after the fact that The Simpsons are drawn horribly, and originally were drawn horrible and are yellow, and yet there's plenty of Lisa Simpson and Bart Simpson animated porn images that were made. So there's no level of character that some kind of Rule 34 animation won't be made, or and that's just a thing you have to admit and accept that it's always the case. It was the case before even the internet existed, is that somebody in their mind, in their artistic ability, might create sexualized porn parody versions of anything and everything. So inherently, it feels like a just made up excuse. The second argument that this inspires certainly is, what happened to freedom of choice? Or, I mean, really freedom of expression at a certain point here too. Like, if I buy a product and I want to install a mod that somebody else has generously made, or make my own mod, what's so wrong with letting me do that? Why can't I enjoy a sexualized mod of any game in the privacy of my own home, in the privacy of my own thoughts and minds? Like, how does that really hurt your product in any ways, to the point where you feel you need this special protection, which you won't get, by the way, because modding, emulating a PS5 game is not going to be too far away from doable. Of course, this is all going to fall apart as soon as they do announce a PC version. It's a really terrible excuse too. Like, the more acceptable excuse would be to say nothing, really. That is the right thing, is just to say we do not have any PC launch plans at this time, or we don't have any announcements to make at this time, is the absolute right thing to say. But you could also make the appeal to say we just don't have the funding and the expertise to release a good PC port, which frankly most PC gamers would cut you a lot of slack to say we could put out a PC port, but it's going to be buggy and not look as good because we don't have that expertise, so please just buy the PS5 version. This excuse is just going to have a lot of people who very possibly would have never bought this game in the first place now aggressively and vocally come out and say they're never going to buy this game, and potentially boycott this game, potentially boycott all of your future games, because you've made a anti-porn mod stance, of which there is a fairly large audience of people who do like porn mods. Overwatch had somewhat of a similar stance, that they weren't particularly happy about the massive amount of tracer porn mods, the tracer porn art that was made, that wasn't even in the game as a mod. But yeah, this feels very puritanical, and I would hate to see, I don't believe this is the case, but I would really hate to see it become a situation where more game developers take this stance, and even laws or legal efforts go against modders in particular on this kind of puritanical witch hunt anti-porn movement. I really hate for that to become the case. That being said, it's not nothing these days is beyond the realm of possibility. We may very well see a heavy push towards censorship against sex mods and things like that first, which then will very quickly go down the slippery slope and just be censorship against violence, and then censorship against video games in general. Even if it is only really in the realm of mods at first, this is definitely still a censorship issue, in that they are vocally saying that they're trying to stop people from experiencing games in the way that they might want to experience it. Skyrim is definitely a good example too of where there would be a lot less happy people out there if Skyrim was not allowed to have all the sex mods that exist there. And Skyrim would not be anywhere as popular today, decades later, if it weren't for its adult mods. And yeah, generally speaking, I think the best move for game developers is to make their game and sell their game and not worry about mods in general, adult content, Rule 34 stuff. Don't mention it, don't acknowledge it, just don't worry about it, because it doesn't affect your bottom line, and it doesn't affect anything. We are far, far from the point where any real hay is going to be made if there is an adult mod for a game and some underage kid buys a rated T for T game and then mods it so then it becomes adults only rated content. That's not going to fall on the game developer and cause any conflict at all, because that would obviously be a situation that could be explained away as, hey, the kid knew what he was doing or should have known what he was doing, and it's not the fault of the original creators. We are very far away from hot coffee mods being a thing that causes any real controversy. Or at least I hope we are. So yeah, it's a shame, because I really have to come away from this and go, well, this company is not freedom of, they're not free speech, that in the sense that they're anti people expressing and experiencing a game they want to, in a way they want to experience it. It's sad to say that PlayStation itself is also anti-free speech in that same way, freedom, anti-free expression that way. Nintendo definitely is there, although it's pretty easy to give Nintendo a pass because Nintendo was always selling itself as being a family-friendly environment, and yeah, it always is going to kind of feel that way. But yeah, for myself, I think that pretty much eliminates me buying Code Violet or playing any Team Kill Media game. I don't know why you'd shoot yourself in the foot like this by making this kind of public statement, when particularly you're now shooting your future co-workers in the foot too, because it may very well be that a different publisher or a different person gets put in charge, and then all of a sudden that opinion changes and they have to backpedal on something that they really wouldn't have had to backpedal on otherwise. Moving on, the Pokemon Center London, as far as here's how you can reserve your spot. Remember, videogameschronicle.com is set in UK based, so that's why they put out this information, which is not going to be useful to anybody outside of the UK, more than likely. EA is shutting down Origin on PC and Mac. Players will need a 64-bit operating system to access their games. Players that are still using Origin will have to swap over to the EA app or lose their PC game libraries. I wonder when was the last time Origin was updated at all. And in fairness, it is also worth pointing out that you would have to have a pretty old computer for a 32-bit operating system to actually be installed on it. Of course, that does include everybody who has a retro PC or who has a game that they want to play on a hardware of that era for one reason or another, which there are a few people like that that have retro PCs to play their old games and not end up with newer operating systems that can be more bloated. Of course, those old kind of PCs almost certainly have to be air-gapped and not connected to the internet in the first place, which might exclude Origin, which very well may be calling home. I guess on a certain point, if Origin wasn't acting as DRM and wasn't calling home to a server, then you could just have the latest version, but that doesn't seem to be the case in this issue. Seems like it's automatically transferring over to the EA app, but yeah. Things move forward. Let's see. Microsoft is still offering 32-bit versions of Windows until mid-2020. So yeah, if you have a five-year-old computer or older, then you might have the 32-bit version of Windows 10 or some older version of Windows 10. And most people though would have had a 64-bit version of an operating system. Yeah. I guess the slightly good news is it's highly unlikely there would be a reason that we would move from 64-bit versions of operating systems to 128-bit versions anytime in the next 100 years even. Like, not unless there's just some major improvements and reduction in cost of very high amounts of RAM and or hard drive space, which is really the only numbers that would require a 128-bit operating system. Two to the power of 64. Let me just do the math here and see. I believe is yeah. Oh, that wasn't right numbers. Yeah. 2 to the power of 64 is 1.84 times 10 to the 19th power, roughly. So it is a massive number. Maybe I'm doing the math wrong. Let's see, 64 to the power of 2 is 4096, which is far too small of a number. So yeah, I did the math the right way the first time. But yeah, in comparison, 2 to the power of 128 would be 3.402 times 10 to the 38th power, which is a much larger massive number, but not something that you really would ever need. Inherently, those kinds of giant numbers are not needed for day-to-day precision calculations, and possibly not even helpful for scientific levels of precision mathematics. And yeah, you're just not going to have that much RAM, likely even in 100 years. More likely, we would just have quantum computers working on a completely different system. Yeah, so I would say a quantum bit operating system is more likely, in my opinion, to be the next evolution as far as massive changes in operating systems. Of course, there were some minor bit changes to operating systems too, and yes, this really has nothing to do with Origin dropping support, but I can't really be too angry about them dropping support. And in a lot of ways, it's mostly, I guess, them dropping Origin branding. It is worth pointing out, though, that there are some minor changes that are big issues too, like having a trusted platform module chip 2.0 in your computer, which many computers still don't have that, and many, I would argue, computers don't really need it, and yet it's being required as part of Windows 11. I could see them adding more instruction sets to the chip standards, like SSX is one of the expansions of the Intel instruction set, and you can see those kinds of instructions being required while not really changing it to a 64-bit operating system. And see, that would create a situation where certain things are required, but it just doesn't have a fancy label and branding way of describing it. Also, it's very possible we will have operating systems that just start to require an ARM like efficiency cores and versus power cores, and that would drastically change how your computer does things too, and that maybe even desktops at some point will have efficiency cores that run at very lower frequencies but have a lot more of them, which again would change how 64-bit operating system works, but would change how computers in general work. Although we would be a far way around from people making apps that are specifically know that you have efficiency cores and are actively trying to use them. The way, as far as I can tell, the way Android really is doing it now is that it's mostly running all the cores in your cell phone at a slower than maximum speed, and then when a game goes into full screen mode and goes into game mode, that is the only time that your phone actually ramps up and starts running at its full possible speed. And surprisingly, that works well enough too, that you just 99.9% of the time on your phone are underclocking it. Moving on. A third-party publisher says it expects the Switch to be released between April and September. This is Nacon's recent financial earnings report, which I take that certainly with a grain of salt. NCSoft's Horizon MMORPG has seemingly been cancelled. One of the two Horizon multiplayer projects has been cancelled, the report claims. This is according to South Korean site MTN News. It is always weird, particularly when you have Video Games Chronicle pick its seemingly mandatory screenshot And one of the options for Horizon is one of the latest, most recent pictures that they put out, which was done for pro LGBTQIA celebrations. And so here we have a case where Aloy is being decked out in a way that I don't think she can even actually look in the game to celebrate LGBTQIA measures, and that screenshot is being used when that is not the topic being discussed at all. In a funny contrast here, I feel like Horizon and Aloy is a character that probably could have benefited a little bit more from being released on PC and having adult mods released on it. That certainly would have allowed for a counter audience to spring up saying, no, we love Aloy and we like her and we sexualize her as a character and do all that Rule 34 stuff. At least having a small counter audience of that would be helpful versus the audience that really was unhappy with them fairly changing the way she looked in the second game, the visuals there. But yeah, it definitely feels like that first game, the Aloy of the first game, was fairly beloved, and just a little bit of bad reaction and bad press ruined her as a character. And I think enough pushback and enough SJW slacktivism happened around Horizon that now there's just so much controversy around her. It's going to be hard, if I ever get around to it, for me to just play Horizon and not have to talk about those subjects or have those negative feelings, at least in the back of my mind. Negative feelings that mostly are coming from other people, since I haven't played either games and really don't care that much. There is, I suppose, been a push by several of the bigger organizations that are pro-LGBTQ to not have sexualization be a part of their celebration of their identities, which is kind of weird. And on one hand, it's still fairly ineffective, because there's definitely a lot of pride parades still where gay people are scantily clad out and celebrating their bodies and their sexuality in fairly obnoxious and extreme ways. But there definitely have been organizations that also are very much on the opposite of that efforts. Yeah, I don't even know really to go further with that, but yeah, particularly in SJW video game slacktivism, there seems to be this odd anti-attractiveness, but also they're gay. Particularly on Horizon, where they make her gay in DLC at the last second. And yeah, it's just a weird stance, weird inconsistency there in my mind. Yes, lesbians are not usually designed there just to be sexualized from the male gaze, but then also In the case of a video game, in the case of a fictional character, you can do that if you want to. Anyways, I feel like I've been on this topic twice already today, so that's not what I want all of my live streams to be about. Let's move on in the news. Concept art for EA's next Battlefield game may have used a real-life photo of an explosion in Gaza. The artist noted similarities between Battlefield's concept art and a 2021 Gaza photo. This may very well be a case where it's being photo referenced, or that it is simply being inspired, photo reference, traced, whatever you want to call it, to whatever extreme. I would say in general, if we look at the pictures, we've got a bunch of white buildings. Okay. And then we've got fire, which is pretty random and natural, with a big black smoke cloud that goes up higher and higher. So that's the real picture. Here, we have a lot more varieties of buildings as far as the front, with red rooftops over here in this section here, which, yeah, not really that consistent there. Buildings in general consistent. And we have a red fire with a big black smoke and it leading up to this point, which does seem fairly similar, if not exact, to the fire here. See if these three buildings here can be found here. No. So what my guess here is that this photo part here was cut out and straight up copied. That being said, I would say it was really just a fire and explosion here that was copied. Buildings look different, and this upper cloud section looks different. Obviously the battlefield part is different. There's no battlefield text here. The rest of the sky looks fairly different, but I wouldn't be surprised if it is a case that the entirety of the sky here was also copied. But yeah. So somebody got lazy there, I would imagine, and this was not intentional or something that would be standard practice at DICE. I almost certainly would expect that they hired a advertisement team or concept artist outside of EA to do it, and this is one of those cases why you have to vet your sources, and you have to put kind of a significant amount of pressure on artists too, to say, hey, this kind of product is going to be scrutinized by a very large audience, and you're not going to get away with stealing even a small part of another photo. We need the art to be 100% original. We need to own 100% of the copyright on it for this work for hire job. And inherently this is a case where, because it seems like some of that content has been sampled, photo referenced, there is now a copyright issue, and that they probably didn't have the rights to use that photo. So that might very well lead to a lawsuit. And I would say, when we look at the entirety of the image, this is a very large image here, So only a small part of the image may be copyright infringing. That being said, that tends not to really matter in the field of still imagery as much, because you definitely are not using that small part for commentary or criticism or review, or even as a photo collage concept. So you're not going to get any kind of exemptions from copyright infringement doing it that way. And inherently, since you probably would be found guilty of copyright infringement, any possible proceeds or income from this copyright infringement may very well be given to the original photographer of the original photo, which that's a issue certainly that EA would definitely want to avoid. Take note here, though, that we have pretty much evolved past the point of caring that video games like Battlefield have levels of graphics of violence and destruction that is in line with realistic visuals. I mean, we've really just proven that here. If somebody can steal a real photo and have concept art that looks like a video game, there is very little difference now between video game depictions of wartime violence and real world depictions of wartime violence. And we're not even really we're past the point of even discussing that as far as how that affects society and whether there's any real issue there, which personally I would say there isn't, but it certainly is worth mentioning that we have hyper realistic violence now in video games. And that's the realism argument, but also you certainly have the violence argument, which has also mostly disappeared completely, in that people know what Battlefield is and that it is going to be a violent game series, and there is no big pushback from those games coming out. So as far as freedom of expression, as far as being able to make the kind of games you would want to make, or they want to make, we've made a decent amount of progress there, in that there is no longer those pearl clutching arguments against these kinds of games. That being said, it's sadly maybe a little too late, because I think there's a ever decreasing audience of people who actually want to play these militaristic shooter style games. Moving on, Marvel Snap is back online apparently. Now that it is, the developer says it wants a new publisher, which is an interesting thing to say out loud. I imagine there is a significant number of people out there who want new publishers, but that's not going to legally give them any way in which they can change publishers. Inherently, if Marvel Snap and Second Dinner and Ben Brode's company, Second Dinner, had the rights to the game, had the game been handed over to that publisher, from the publisher to the developer, in the sense that the publisher has gotten all the money that they were legally required to recoup for paying for the development of Marvel Snap. If Second Dinner has the rights to the game, then yes, they could get a new publisher. If they haven't sold enough or made enough money, or if they never made a contractual agreement that the rights to the game would ever shift back to Second Dinner, well, then it's just not going to happen. No publishers is going to say, yeah, sure, we'll hand over the rights to the game even though we never agreed to do that to you. Although, maybe this is the end, because maybe this is more of a deeper statement that Second Dinner is just saying, we want a new publisher, and we're just going to kind of abandon Marvel Snap and make a new game, which wouldn't be the worst case. Here we can see Donald Trump's name being put in this article, not completely out of nowhere, but it definitely seems to me like that was search engine optimization in being enacted. There's speculation out there that ByteDance intentionally, and TikTok intentionally was taken down. All the other ByteDance apps and TikTok was taken down intentionally to make it look as terrible as possible, with perhaps TikTok's parent company and ByteDance already knowing that Trump was going to give them a stay of execution, as it were, for TikTok. And thus, this was all just a ploy to make Donald Trump look good when it was all restored. Which I can understand that speculation and fairly can believe it, considering how the law really hasn't changed at all. And even in this, though, it is interesting to say that Trump's executive order giving TikTok, I believe it's 45 days before they have to shut down or sell the company. I mean, that's not a permanent thing, really. But I wonder if that isn't where they're saying it's not planned. Is that they're not saying it, they're coming against that speculation, saying no, ByteDance did not intentionally plan to take down the things. They're saying they're working to bring more services in-house and partner with a new publisher. This is the start of a new era for Marvel Snap, which is frankly the statement I didn't want to hear from Second Dinner. That they are just going to double down on Marvel Snap. Which, yeah. I don't think that there's a ton of new people that would ever come to Marvel Snap, and I don't think that there's a ton of people still playing Marvel Snap that anyway, so it's a shame. I was really hoping for a lot more from Second Dinner than what we got, and it seems to me like they are going to just become like Destiny creators, Bungie is now, and that they are going to perpetually only work on one game and maybe the sequel to one game, and never have any room to make any other side projects or make a different game. I think it's probably a bit of a mistake, as far as card games specifically go, to have licenses built into your card game. Pokemon card game is clearly a licensed game, but it has the benefit of having hundreds of Pokemon to select from. But Yu-Gi-Oh! Is non-licensed content, which leaves them very open to make any and every kind of card they can think of, and Magic the Gathering is in the same spot, or at least they have been in the same spot for a very long time. Now we are starting to see licensed products show up in Magic the Gathering, but there's still a very large core base in which Magic the Gathering can be played ignoring those licensed elements, or at least it could have been for many years. So yeah, if I was going to make a card game, I definitely would want to make a card game with a whole new set of characters, not tied to a license. I guess it's worth mentioning, though, that even Hearthstone started with characters from the World of Warcraft universe, so they didn't start from complete scratch. Moving on, January's upcoming Game Pass titles include 4 more Day 1 releases. Microsoft has detailed the rest of January's Game Pass titles and February's ones, which we can scroll down the list here fairly quickly. Not recognizing a ton of these games. Let's see, you can read the first Metaphor ReFantazio manga adaptation chapter for free. On what website? First chapter can be read here at this link. The Japanese adaptation will be serialized in the weekly V-Jump magazine. Interesting. I'm really not aware of how many. Probably shouldn't show the comics too much. I'll just show that first page and leave it at that. No, there are several Japanese magazines of serialized manga, but I'm not sure how many of them have English translations that are coming out regularly. I have been thinking about that, though. Certainly think my nieces and nephews might enjoy if once a month they were getting a magazine, assuming it was age appropriate, like Shonen Jump. But more than likely, even if there are a few things like V-Jump magazine, which is something I want to look into, it's still probably better waiting until it would be collected and printed in the physical version, and collected in such a way that you're only covering one of the serialized contents. It's kind of like there's two experiences, as I understand, in Japan, where you would read Shonen Jump specifically for the newest kind of content, and then months, if not years later, you might buy an individual volume of a manga for an individual series, and so that would be the second time you would read it and revisit it after the fact. It is fairly surprising, though, that this doesn't happen more, and that this isn't more of a thing around video games in general, that there would be comic adaptations or manga adaptations. It is kind of crazy that those industries are so disconnected from video games when they both involve animation. Of course, video games are uniquely interactive, and so that makes a weirdness to it. I'd also say this art style is a little bit weird. That I don't know what I'd really call this other than maybe colored pencil or marker drawings. Seems to have an odd amount of kind of curviness to it. But yeah, not a real typical art style I see a lot of. Let's see, Xbox has revealed the Pulse Cypher controller, which is literally more than I think I even want to say about it, so we'll leave it at that. It's priced at $75. Man, that's expensive. Call of Duty Warzone Season 2 new content has been shifted as devs focus on fixing foundational issues. Okay, I'll leave that at that. A Mexico tariff could lead to fewer physical game releases and increased software prices. Physical and digital game prices could raise if US imposes a 25% duty on imports from Mexico. Now, I kind of want to get more into the details here as what specifically is being imported from Mexico towards game releases. It could be anything and everything. I wouldn't be surprised if there aren't just a lot of ports at that where products are brought into Mexico and then driven over the border from Mexico. Let's see. Because otherwise, I'm trying to think, like, are the plastic pellets and the stamping of Blu-ray discs happening in Mexico? Are physical plastic shells of Xboxes and PlayStations being made in Mexico? Like, almost certainly tariffs will raise the price of things in general, but you know, I was not really aware of too much actually crossing the border from Mexico into the United States as far as video games are concerned. Although it is, without which this article is not really getting into the weeds as far as what is coming across the border from Mexico to the United States that's video game related. It is also a great example to point out, though, if Blu-ray discs are being stamped in Mexico and driven over the border, it's going to be more than 4 years, probably closer to 10, before you could build a factory to stamp Blu-ray discs in the United States to replace that. And that's an example of where tariffs, not always a terrible idea, they have to be fairly slow and long-lived for them to potentially get the effect that you're hoping for, which would be to move industry back into your own borders or encourage consumers to stop consuming, which the United States, being a very capitalistic country, has no real intention of being post-consumerism in any way, so they're really not focusing on that. The internal circuitry, the internal components of a console, definitely not going to be things that you can make new factories quickly to replace. Although I don't know how many of those things are actually being built in Mexico. I wouldn't be surprised if there's perhaps some hard drive motors being made in Mexico, or Blu-ray drive motors being made in Mexico. But generally speaking, you kind of assume that all of that is being built and assembled in like Taiwan or China. It is very possibly being put on a ship and brought to Mexican ports and then again brought over the border. But yeah. This is a great example of an article that needs more info. And yeah, unfortunately, these kind of market research people do generally seem to only make kind of statements based on what they would like to see happen more than based on any real evidence or facts that they can back it up from. Yeah. arguably this is also yet another article that is not particularly connected uniquely to video games, because this is just talking like a general 25% tariff, which would definitely increase the prices for people buying things coming in from Mexico and not in any way have Mexico paying the tariffs. Even if Mexico was paying the tariffs, they would increase the price of everything more than 25% to make up the difference. A more direct story like this that would be truer to what it's actually claiming would be if there was a 25% tariff being proposed against Japan or China or Taiwan or Korea, South Korea. All of those are the places where games and parts of games are really being designed, assembled, and sold from. Let's see, apparently 11% of developers surveyed by GDC, which, yeah, GDC, apparently doing a survey and yet not really making any news articles. 11% of game developers overall who were surveyed by GDC were laid off in the past year. Let's see. And then the research suggests that 41% of developers have been impacted by job cuts over the past 12 months. Which, yeah. Inherently, if you're not laid off, but your coworker is laid off, your workload has increased more than likely. Or you have a new employee that has to be trained, or that you have to establish a new relationship with. All of which would still affect you. I think this survey is fairly old, so it kind of feels like Video Games Chronicle is getting to this fairly late. As a gamer, I generally am kind of monogamous, if that's a word, and don't want to see game developers laid off. On the other hand, I'm also kind of pragmatic and have to admit that almost certainly more than 11% of game developers suck. So if the right 11% of game developers were fired and left the game industry completely, that could be a bettering of the games that do get released. Unfortunately, it's very rarely the case that the right 11% of anybody is laid off. And in general, if these layoffs were done properly in a way that the cost of games went down, I think most gamers would be happy with that situation. The developers wouldn't, and in the long run it might be it almost certainly would be a bad thing. But yeah, the industry needs to downsize itself in the sense of bloated budgets and expensive $100 games that they want to sell. But the best way for them to really accomplish that would be to all go private and not have activist investors driving the ship. Excuse me. But yeah, as long as you have private equity firms investing in your video game company demanding ever increasing profits, the game industry, like most industries, is doomed towards this eventual bubble bursting and eventual collapse of the economic system completely. Yeah, the real hope would be that video game companies would go private And in that process, they could shed 11% of their management pretty easily and just focus on making games that make reasonable amounts of progress but also are developed on reasonable amounts of budgets. They need to look very, very earnestly at the Hollywood situation and avoid that at all costs, where Hollywood has become an extremely bloated system of upper management and middle management and extremely high budgets in the hopes of making back extremely large amounts of profits, with there being no interest in making a mid-budget or a low-budget movie at all. Another thing that's not related to this conversation is Hollywood really needs to think about a better system for casting. It is kind of crazy that your credits, if you've worked on other projects, and then often just a few minutes standing in front of the directors is how you're determined whether you're the best actor for that job or not. That really just seems like a really stupid way to do things, when more than likely you should be constantly doing exercises and making footage and getting roles, but it kind of needs to be more standardized too. So it kind of feels like there should be acting schools, and in those acting schools there should be acting projects in which you would do probably the great plays. So you do Hamilton and Othello and things like that, and then that way you could compare one actor's ability to doing those plays versus another actor's ability. Whereas I imagine the vast majority of Hollywood actors have not done any kind of stage play acting, and while that is a very different thing, just being able to see if they have the skill to do that much would be very helpful, and have that kind of portfolio. Most actors don't seem to really even have any kind of video portfolios at all, and they're just sending headshots, and it really highlights how vain and vapid Hollywood is that they really are just hiring somebody who looks the part and hoping that they can actually act, which I don't think has worked out particularly greatly. Of course, that really doesn't have anything to do with video games, so let's move on. A survey suggests that the passion for PC game development has exploded. 80% of developers surveyed by GDC are working on a PC game, and 8% are making Switch 2 titles. I assume this is the same GDC survey with different questions. The passion from developers, though, may not be 100% matched as far as publishers go. It's still fairly easy to believe that publishers want the safer bet and the old school bet. What we should keep an eye out for as far as the Switch 2 comes out, that will be the newest marker as far as where the consumer's passion is, and if the Switch 2 in particular just sells very poorly, and you see a pretty obvious contrast of Steam Deck and handhelds and PC gaming going up while the Switch 2 sales are going down, that's the kind of trend that would convince a publisher to say we shouldn't be selling on the Switch 2 and targeting that. We should be targeting PC, which, yeah, there are regional issues there too, because Japanese game developers are going to be slightly slower to embrace PC development and learn something new, even if the Switch 2 sells very poorly. There is still also room for improvement, and so I'm still hoping for a continued and increased level of improvement from SteamOS and the Steam Deck. And I'm hoping that continues to be the case. Because, yeah, it is definitely not a perfect experience yet. And I don't know if PC gaming would ever get to that point, but there's still a lot of room for improvement. Overall, 80% of developers being excited in PC development and PC games may also improve Steam releases overall, and that I'm hoping eventually some of the low effort asset flip game developers who make garbage games give up and either make better games or leave the industry completely. Moving on, Sonic the Hedgehog 4 movie release date has been confirmed by Paramount. Spring of 2027, March 19th of 2027. Okay. The new PlayStation Plus games catalog titles have been released, including God of War Ragnarok. So, another month. We'll scroll down this list around that. Yeah, I don't know how I would ever play one of those poker games. Like, I can feel twinges in which I'd like to play a poker game, but it just takes too much time. I think they basically would have to create a very snappy version of poker. Just like 5-card draw, one draw, and that's it. And like a really sped up, you're not playing with other people per se, so you don't have players taking forever to take their turn. But yeah, that kind of experience is, I think, what you would really need. And arguably something like Bellertro may do something like that better, having it, the fact that Bellertro is not really poker and has a lot more variety and randomness to it. Moving on, Sega has launched a Sega account, an online profile with in-game bonuses. Players who register will get a unique outfit for Like a Dragon Pirate Yakuza in Hawaii. It's kind of interesting Sega's doing this. It probably shows how Sega has always been behind the times as far as deciding to do things like this. It is really not what modern companies want to do, considering there's all kinds of privacy laws around that and age gate restrictions around that. And in modern times, having individual accounts for a video game company in particular just doesn't make a lot of sense. On the other hand, I will say Shift Up and Shift Keys are not a terrible experience, and that is very individualized to just Gearbox games. Although, in fairness, Shift Keys also are fairly limited in that they are just giving you gold keys to use in the game later. Alright, well, unfortunately, I'm gonna have to take a bathroom break, and not thinking it's gonna be super long, but I probably should pause. It was probably pretty stupid for me not to pause previously, so I'm gonna go ahead and do that, and I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back. I have to say that when you're watching a dual live replay here, it gives you, feels like 3 seconds at most, maybe even 2.5 seconds to cancel it auto playing the next video. And I think of myself as a fairly fast-paced person who can respond fairly quickly to things, and I tend not to ever get that as far as clicking the button fast enough. We can see here Yu-Gi-Oh is still doing some things. Of course, I'm not really playing the game anymore, so I'm just slowly eating away at the last bit of my gems that I get buying things. But yeah, I really wish those replays were a little bit easier to stop and a little bit easier to speed up and end, because almost every time when I come back from a break, I am sitting here watching the replay for another 30 seconds to a minute, just hoping, even in fast forward mode, for it to finish. Although inherently, eventually I will get around to making a different, hopefully better screensaver to play when I am taking breaks. Sadly, I can't make any real improvement as far as making it so breaks don't happen in the first place, which that's still an issue that I would like to be able to fix, but it's just not going to happen. Not until I can get my Android body that completely replaces everything wrong with my current body, or everything human about my current body, and that's not happening anytime soon, or ever. Moving on, Nintendo Video has revealed how the Switch 2 Joy-Cons are removed, which there has been a decent amount of speculation that these little triggers here were exclusively designed to remove the Joy-Cons in whatever magnetic fashion it is. My question, and we'll hopefully get that answered, is whether there is any magnet down here at the bottom, or whether there might just be a nub that the whole thing just pivots into, a little plastic nub, which it looks like it might be a plastic nub. And then it'd be interesting to know how this technology really is working, whether there's something electromagnetically holding it, which I don't think it is. I think that this column might be a magnetic rod, and that there's something around this disc that maybe it spins when the magnetic rod is here, that makes it align to another magnetic disc here. So you'd have like a circular magnet that where half of it is north, half of it is south, and then this pin may be north in itself, and maybe this ring is spring loaded, and so if the pin retracts, maybe it spins this disc. I'm just speculating wildly here, so let's just, but yeah, I'm interested in seeing how that holds. And the magnet could be potentially very strong if you are just convincing it to spin around and switch its orientation to line up with another magnet. Another thing certainly that deserves to be mentioned, though, is it looks like there might be more repairability in these new Joy-Cons, because it does look like it's just screws here, which is a very non-Nintendo thing to do, is to have easy to see, easy to access screws to take apart a Joy-Con and replace it, which that may be their solution to Joy-Con drift anyways, is to just have it be a more repairable thing. So let's find this video. Extended look has confirmed how they remove. Nintendo uploaded several long animations to the Switch 2 website. One of his animations. So none of this is linking back. Like if I click Nintendo here, it's going to be keyword Nintendo at Video Games Chronicle. If I click Switch 2 here, it's going to be Switch 2 Here, website is not a link. I know I've hidden all these links so that it's hard to see which text would be that. So I think the easiest thing to do here would be to just DuckDuckGo, switch to, and go to the official site. See if that app works. Well, that took me to a different website. Nope, that's not it either. Alright, so we would assume that there would be something else. There would be an easy way to see all this. Let's try the second link. Okay. Watch the trailer. Region selector. Maybe you have to go into a different region. Okay, skip that. Okay. So this is a great example, I think, of why you need the links from news sources and why I need other news sources to talk about the news. It would just take way too much work and way too much time to get the important facts and visuals otherwise. We can also highlight here how it's pretty obvious that these light up sections here just have little bits of plastic to focus and continue the light on the professional controller, which the professional controller piece of plastic still doesn't look particularly great. I can't help but wonder, see that little nudge there, so, and see how it always is the case that they're kind of pivoting it in, they're not just slamming it in on the sides. Actually, it looks like when you pull the trigger, it pushes the rod outward. Yeah. And there's a little button-like device that it looks like it's pushing, so maybe all the magnetics changing is actually happening on this side, with very little actually happening on this side. That would kind of make more sense to put the bigger physical bulky things there. One thing I would say, though, is that I'm clearly no expert at design, but I can't help but wonder, if you're going to have it swing in and pivot in, should it be pivoting in from the bottom the way controllers are held? Because I could imagine people twisting or putting at least a little bit of twisting force from in that same direction while just pressing the buttons and pulling the triggers and stuff. I can't imagine anybody ever twisting in the opposite direction. So if you just thrown the entire circuitry or design the entire mechanism in this case the other way around, so it comes into a nub at the top and then swings down and pivots to lock in. That would I think work a little bit safer. But I guess that their thought is that that is just going to hold. Although it may be the case that there is actually very strong magnets actually holding it down here and weaker magnets holding it up there. But yeah, it is not a magnet at the top and a magnet at the bottom, and that's all that's holding it together. There's definitely more going on. Not sure if any of these other animations are particularly going to show us anything interesting. Though clearly they wanted to visually clarify how the Joy-Cons actually connect. And yeah, we can once again just look at the different feel of this compared to the Steam Deck, and that all of these buttons and controllers, here are very much still in this vertical feeling with no touchpads elements. It does just, even if the controllers are bigger, feel like it's going to be a fairly awkward situation in which you're going to have your thumb arcing over this analog stick to press buttons and almost never use this analog stick, or you're going to have, and the same is kind of here, that you're going to have your thumb arcing over buttons to go to this analog stick, or you're going to use buttons as a D-pad. The next Nintendo console, which is almost certainly going to be years away if they even might get that far, is definitely needs to consider abandoning the Joy-Con concept, because it really is just not worth it. I have never seen anybody actually take the Joy-Cons apart and turn them sideways for anything. And as far as retro games and NES games, if you're going to do that, Nintendo should have just sold an accessory, a wireless NES, Super NES controller, things like that, which they did sell a few of those anyways. But yeah, the modern gameplay style controllers should not be held back or constrained towards a design to play older games. And even though these controllers are bigger, they didn't really move the buttons down any. It'll be interesting to know if the distance from like the center of this analog stick and the center of these 4 buttons is any different at all on the newer controllers. I don't think it is. So if these are supposed to be Joy-Cons for bigger hands, you would think that they would be further apart, and it just doesn't really seem like that's the case. Anyways, moving on. Phantom Blade Zero reportedly got substantial investment due to Black Myth Wukong's success. It is interesting, though, that nobody is really talking about Black Myth Wukong at this point, which is certainly the danger of making a single-player game, particularly one that isn't getting a lot of post-launch DLC and post-launch promotion. There is also certainly a danger in getting the wrong kinds of investors who would be too demanding or too expecting in the game industry. Astrobot has won another Game of the Year award. Let's see, this is from the New York Game Awards, I would assume. Which I make all the arguments in general that end of the year Game of the Year awards should happen in January when it's slow, and still have to shamefully admit that I did not see anything about the New York Game Awards. I maybe saw an article with the nominations a couple of weeks ago, but I just don't think they have a live stream or a big enough event, even if there is a live stream, to catch people's attention. And some of that definitely is the case, that the Video Game Awards is just so big and is so close to the end of the year that it sucks all the oxygen out of the room. But yeah, a big part of that is that if the New York Game Awards wants to be something, they need to find a way to convince people to subscribe to their YouTube channel or be seen in some other way, be talked about in some other way. Of course, with all the Hollywood fires recently, something like the Game Awards might move venues, and other award seasons out of Hollywood may decide to move venues, or events may decide to be replaced with other events. We might see a lot more New York based award shows, maybe even a few Texas based award shows. In general, I can't imagine though that there would be too many other award shows in any other locations though. And notice how I said Texas based and not specifically any city in Texas. Moving on, Pokemon TCG Pocket players spent $8,500. Well, a player spent $8,500 hitting the daily Pokemon Gold limit since launch. He has already collected 50,000 cards in Pokemon TCG Pocket, so they found the whale, as it were. 50,000 cards. Let's just talk here for a second, since I just opened a pack. I have, as a free-to-play player, I believe 1,527 cards, and I have spent $0, so I am at 1.5%. No, actually it would be closer to 3.5%, I think, of what this whale has. And well, I can't give an exact numbers. Actually, I can. Of the Genetic Apex expansion, I have 217 of 226 cards. Some of those cards are actually just fanciful secret cards. Of the most recent expansion, Mystic Island, I have 66 out of 68 cards. And there are systems certainly designed so that you will eventually get the missing cards. So I have very little fear that I won't eventually just have all of the cards that are in Pokemon TCG. And if anything, I would say they've made it a little bit easy to have all the cards. Pokemon TCG in particular seems to be a game designed so that most players can have all the cards, although most players won't have all the different artistic variations of the cards, at least in the digital form. I have no idea how terrible it is as far as actually opening packs of real world Pokemon cards. It might be very expensive and very difficult, which is all just a very long-winded way of saying this guy is more than likely wasting his money. It is, I guess, nice that there is a maximum, but yeah, it is also a bad product in my opinion, in that card trading is still not enabled. The experiences to convince people to actually play the game instead of just collecting cards is pretty terrible. Spending Pokemon Gold for the cosmetic things is almost certainly not worth it, and definitely you would not be needing to spend $8,500. My only hope here is he only spent $8,500 since launch, and that he wasn't spending $8,500 every single day buying Pokemon Gold. Inherently, this is a great example of where some people, even if they are rich, need to be constrained from following their impulses, because this is inherently an excessive, opulent way to spend $8,500 when there's almost certainly there's almost certainly something better you could do with $8,500 for society, or even for yourself. And this little scene that shows 50,000 cards is a scene where the numbers are just going to constantly go up regardless. I'm still also not super happy with the fact that you can get different language versions of the cards instead of just being able to toggle switch to see the cards in different languages. So if you really wanted to be obsessive, you can get Spanish versions of the Pokemon cards and Japanese versions of the Pokemon cards, and I'm not sure there are any other languages it supports, but that inherently triples the possible cards you might want to collect if you're obsessive about it, which I definitely assume this guy is obsessive about it. Moving on, apparently the Resident Evil 2 remake sold fewer than 10,000 copies on iOS, an estimate suggests. Since the price rose from $10 to $40, it's estimated that fewer than 200 people have bought it. Which, yeah, this might be yet another nail in the coffin of the concept of gaming on iOS, in particular Apple phones. But yeah, there is really just not an established market, as far as I can tell, as far as paying even $10 for a game, regardless of its level of quality and polish. But inherently, Resident Evil 2 Remake, I imagine, is just not an experience that you would want to play on an iOS cell phone. Yeah. And inherently, yeah, when I want to sit down and play a cinematic narrative experience, I want to do it on a PC or console in front of a TV. I just don't want to do it while I'm sitting on a toilet playing on a phone, which actually don't do that, but plenty of people do. Yeah, the only time I'm playing a game on my phone is usually when I'm taking a break and lying down, and even then I have a TV in front of me, so I could be lying down and playing a controller, but I'm just not in that more alert, awake mode at the time. I don't think I'm too different there. I think most people, when they're playing on the phone, they're out and about and they're just not into the gaming mode concept, in that they want to have a good hour to 2 hour experience playing a game. Horror games on cell phones in particular are probably a really bad idea, but we really haven't had anything succeed particularly well. And things that do succeed on cell phones tend to be Candy Crush and Flappy Bird, just very different, very casual experiences. I think Memento Mori is a pretty nicely polished game, but it is also an idle gacha game that plays itself. So I really don't play a game when I'm playing Memento Mori as much as I'm just handling management and basically almost doing spreadsheet style work when I'm playing Memento Mori. Pokemon TCG Pocket is a game, but it's very much like a tabletop game. It's not a immersive interactive experience. Wow, today is going long already. We just now are getting to the Komatsu articles. Let's move on. Atelier Yumiya, the Alchemist of Memories in the Envisioned Lands game system overview trailer with 15 minutes of gameplay is on this article if you want to check that out. This Atelier Yumiya is the newest of the Atelier series with a new group of characters. The 100-line Last Defense Academy characters trailer is also available, so I wonder if now is just a time where several presentations and announcements are going to happen. Famitsu has its review scores for issue 1883, giving Cardfight Vanguard Dear Days 2 a 30 out of 40, pretty low. Ender Magnolia Bloom Into the Mist, a 33 out of 40, about average. Phantom Brave The Lost Hero, a 32 out of 40. Takes 35 hours to clear and 100 hours with side activities. It is nice to see that Japanese RPG games are starting to fall in line a lot better, too. Where you're seeing games that are only 35 hours to do the main story instead of potentially being 60 hours to do the main story with 100 to 200 hours of side activity. So yeah, some of that grindiness I think is finally being shedded of modern JRPGs. Wuthering Waves for the PS5 has gotten a massive 34 out of 40, which notice how 34 out of 40 is massive and 33 out of 40 is average, or just about average. But yeah, having 4 different reviewers, having an 8, an 8, an 8, and a 9 gets you 33 out of 40. Whereas if it was a 7, a 7, a 7, a 7, that would be 7, 14, 28 out of 40. Really low number. Let's see. Technos, the World Kunio-kun and Arcade Collection has been announced for the PS5, Switch, and PC. It includes 12 rare titles from Technos Japan, which I'm not sure any of these games have really come over to the West before. I definitely am not recognizing any of these names. Maybe Super Dodgeball is something I recognize, but maybe not. Party Animals for the PS5 launches January 23rd. Phantom Blade Zero, Year of the Snake has a gameplay trailer, if you want to check that out at Komatsu. Gotta speed through all of this. Guilty Gear Strive Dual Rulers airs in April and has a main trailer. Is this an anime or is this a game? I think this is an anime. Yeah. Everything is screaming that this is an anime. Based on a fighting game series. A narrative simulation game called Snowtown Geek Store has been announced for PC. Which, interesting. It's an interesting concept that you're in a snow town, so, and then you're running a geek store, which I'm not sure this really looks like a geek store to me as much as this looks like a Japanese snack shop where somebody just sits and smokes out through a window, and you buy snacks through the window, and that's pretty much it. I guess those are the equivalent of what a gas station convenience store might be. At the gas stations that barely just has somebody in the window, and that's it. But yeah, looking around, this just looks like candy. This does not, maybe alcohol. This does not look like geek stuff in my mind, as far as video games or comics or computer stuff or anything like that. And the Snowtown element, I'm not sure how that would really change much. So this visual has intrigued me enough that I would like to see the trailer. Yeah, and I guess it's more of a point and click adventure, or wait, then it went 3D. Weird. Okay. Honestly, it feels like maybe there's some Russian development here, because this feels more Russian influenced than anything else. Geek stores in the past, I guess, probably did have a lot of snacks, but those tended just to be aisle fillers, not things that would be considered main items of selling. Yeah. This is not particularly visually impressive, and I think it is maybe more of a joke experience. That being said, the trailer is showing quite a lot, and the fact that it actually even has a trailer is kind of surprising. It's from the studio that made a game called Torn Away, but I don't recognize a game called Torn Away either. Let's see. If we were to click this here, and then click this here, and click this here, we can see that Torn Away was a 2023 game. It says it blends adventure games, side-scrollings, and cinematics. Okay, well, so I just completely missed this when it came out in 2023. Which I should then give it some credibility and make a YouTube short, which I haven't made any YouTube shorts in a while, in fairness, so I probably need to go ahead and get my computer to do that. Probably time to schedule some more YouTube shorts too. Moving on now, we're almost done with the Komatsu articles. Ninja 5.0 for PS4 and 5 and Switch and PC launches February 25th. Ninja 5.0 sounds to me like it would be something like a parody where it's a ninja police officer, but it overall just looks like a standard old school ninja platforming game. I'm not sure that there ever were any really good ninja platforming games, and there was a ton of very clunky platforming games that came out in the old days. Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader sales have topped 1 million. This is just a year after release, which is a fairly large number, and which it's interesting because I just don't feel like I remember this one. Single player and online co-op game. Story-rich classical RPG from Owlcat Games. Yeah, from my perspective, it feels like there is just like a Diablo-esque style top-down gameplay there. So I may have finally found a Warhammer 40k game that might be worth looking at if I ever get into Warhammer. Perhaps this is a great example too of how a lot of these games just don't get promoted enough and just don't have enough advertisement. I really wish that I would see more commercials for older games somehow, which is asking a crazy thing to want to see more commercials in general. But in fairness, if all of the irrelevant garbage ads I saw on Facebook were just replaced with ads for video games, at least that would catch my attention more. But yeah, video game companies just don't advertise games that are old, and there's no real system for that. The closest thing I could think of that could happen is something like Netflix or Prime Gaming could advertise in the middle of Netflix and Prime Video videos. But yeah, that's not happening either. Moving on, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 post-launch content roadmap has been announced. Free updates and 3 paid story expansions, if they spell story correctly. And last stream it was all about Video Games Chronicle misspelling things in the headlines. Today it's Gematsu misspelling things in the headlines. Clearly these people are not doing a good enough job with spell checks. Although in a certain point maybe it just doesn't pay to double check your spelling. And in fairness, if I was doing it, I probably would misspell a heck of a lot more things too. A chaotic physics-based adventure called Grandma No has been announced for PC, which I would assume this is a crazy grandma doing things that you wouldn't expect a grandma to do, or doing things in a crazy way. And yeah, a silly premise like that does inherently probably need a trailer to explain it. I can't help but wonder if this isn't going to be somewhat similar to QWOP or the one where you're a squid player. You're a squid pretending to be a human. I can't help but wonder if maybe the physics elements of some of those type of games, though, just get in the way of the entertainment aspects of a game like this. And I'm not sure if this one really is that physics based as far as having to control grandma herself, or if it's just physics based on the activity that you do. And at a certain point, this game is parroting and making light of things like old people burning down their house because they become incompetent for one reason or another. And your mileage will vary as far as whether you can find comedy in that, or whether you're actively experiencing something like that and you're just going to be reminded. Because yeah, certainly if you really have a grandmother with dementia or something, this is definitely the kind of game where I don't think you would enjoy it. enjoy that reminder. Moving on, the Indie Live Expo Spring Showcase is set for April 13th. Which, okay. That's, I guess, a big another event coming around the corner. Bellertro has sales topping 5 million. When was Bellertro launched to compare it to the 1 million that the Warhammer 40k game came out with? I really should get into playing Bellertro. But yeah, it came out about a year ago. A month shy of a year ago. February 20th, 2024. And then September. It's only been a few months that it's been on iOS and Android. Bellertro might be an exception of a game that is actually fairly good for cell phones. I really need to get into playing Bellertro at some point, but getting into playing Bellertro would then also immediately require me to get out of playing Bellertro, and it would be better to not get committed to playing a game while I'm still very busy, or should be very busy doing other things. Let's see, Game Pass had Sniper Elite Resistance, Eternal Strands, Citizen Sleeper, Star Wars Vector, and more in late January. So, yeah, scroll down and show the same list we kind of had already shown. There is still some redundancy between my news sources. And then I don't think any of that was new news, so I'm going to just assume my macro went perfectly fine there and got all the new news. Which would bring us to Gaming on Linux, which at this point I'm fairly certain is just opening every single article every single time. And so I don't think any of these games are game review articles are worth mentioning. Yep. And I suspect that there isn't actually any new Gaming on Linux news either. But yeah. Suppose it is still worth pointing out that maybe they just decided to take a bit of a break this week, since there was a holiday on Monday. That also potentially means that there might be a lot of news on Friday. I kind of don't expect that to be the case either. I expect we will find that this is just going to be a slow news week. Of course, that doesn't really ever affect how many games get released on Steam by significant numbers. And yeah, this stream is still going to go on fairly long for that reason alone. Yeah, every single one of these articles is the same one we talked about on Monday. Yeah, not a single one of those is worth mentioning. I think I did say that I had decided I was going to go to a game meetup of adult gamers. One of the concerns there, though, is that there would be a fairly high amount of peer pressure to play something like Marvel Rivals and potentially commit to playing way too much of that. Yeah, it will be a weird situation where I'm going to hang out with gamers and then first thing I have to say is, oh, actually I haven't played any games recently, and when I do play games they tend to be many years old and only for my YouTube channel. there are some elements here, as I'll show. There's no new news from GameDeveloper.com as far as dealing with people too. And while many of my lack of success as far as dealing with people is probably my fault, there definitely is a couple of red flags I want to mention that other people have. And one of those red flags in particular, as a video game critic, to start with, is people who want you to blow smoke up their butt, for lack of a more nicer way of saying it. People who will do a job, and then it may be even a good job, but it's not a perfect job, but they want you to tell you it's a perfect job, and they don't want you to mention that there's more work to be done, or that there's any flaws in the work. And yeah, that's something that, even if I wasn't a video game critic, my level of honesty just can't really abide. So if you want 100% positivity, if you want me to blow smoke up your butt and tell you you're perfect, yeah, that's a red flag. And I don't think that one's on me. I think in most relationships, most people should say that's a red flag, is that if you can't handle any level of honesty / criticism, and when it's honest criticism in particular, that's a red flag too. And then I guess the other one that particularly affects me, being a content creator, having the gift of gab, is when people straight up just can't handle communication or conversations, which, yeah. But yeah, when people can't stay up with the conversation or engage with it, or don't want to engage with it, they just want to sit there and go, yep, yes, or they just want to drink a beer and watch football, when they just want to turn their brain off. That's a bit of a red flag, I think, for a lot of people. Not everybody. Some people totally are cool with sitting in silence with their significant other for 3 hours watching a football game and saying nothing and doing something. But inherently, even then, I think it eventually boils down to there's just way too much of a lack of communication skill, which leads to way too much of a lack of communication. The other one that I think far too many people find acceptable and want, really, as far as these are the issues I see with dealing with people, is that people really love to be flippant and either not form an opinion and stick with it, or be fluid in their opinions just to agree with their friends. And it's like, I think that one's pretty common, and I kind of hate it. I hate when somebody says, hey, I hate that movie, and then somebody goes, oh, but that's my favorite movie. And it's like, the conversation should go from there to say, okay, tell me all about it. I'll listen to why you love that movie. But the conversation very often doesn't go that direction, and it says, it goes in a direction of like, otherwise, you know what, you're right, actually that's a great movie, and that's the end of the conversation often. And I'm saying a very simplified example here, but a lot of times that's the case, is that friends just like agree with each other, and they don't really care in the first place, which is fine if you don't care, but to straight up not be true to your word, or to be so flexible that your friends' opinions changes you when all they're saying is an opinion, without stating any facts, without backing it up with any real argument. Yeah, that I find that irritating. I find that's just, okay, so you're a fake person with fake opinions, and all you really care about is staying within the social group. I'm much more interested in people who would passionately argue with me and have an actual opinion on things than people who just would agree with me. But yeah. But yeah, even those three things, and particularly the last one there, if you're not playing that game, you're going to struggle to make relationships, I think, and maintain relationships. So at a certain point, the sad truth is you may very well just have to play that game and agree with people on things you don't really agree with. Of course, at some point you go down the path of agreeing with people, and eventually you're showing up at a clan rally because you've just gone along with everything. But yeah. One of my personal things that I will blame myself for, though, is talking way too much and dominating conversations, which is definitely something I'm going to have to work on when dealing with people. Although, in fairness, a lot of times if I stop talking, there is just going to be an awkward silence there. But I guess that's the price I need to pay. Yeah, regardless, that has nothing to do with video games. GameDeveloper.com, as you saw, had no new news. Although Gaming on Linux also had no new news, so it is just a very slow week, it seems. So let's go through the games on Steam. And this is a game that barely looks like a game, but also feels like something that I could potentially make in the Godot engine. That being said, it also is a 3D game, which there really requires the game to be more polished than that. This one has a very nice polish to it, but I honestly couldn't tell you what the game actually is. I need to move fast through these games. Poker Dungeon with Anime Girls. Looks like nothing. No Name Game is a terrible name. Dog Walking Adventures. Barely on the list. I may have gotten logged out of Steam, so we may very quickly find that I can't put any more games on my follow list, which inherently I also need to figure out if there's some better way. Incestuous Affair. Interesting. Like, you have what looks like here a Chinese visual novel. Looks like maybe they did a cheap English translation here. I wouldn't be surprised if that is just automatically translated to English. Incest in general isn't very prevalent as a topic in games. Even adult games on Steam tend not to go with incest. We're seeing several different people here, but I would assume it's this male character and this female character that are supposedly going to be related. As far as porn in general, incest is fairly prominent, but I wouldn't be surprised if Valve has been censoring those concepts in general. And certainly, since these are photorealistic looking adult characters instead of anime characters, Valve may be treating this a little bit differently. But in general, I would say this smacks of being low quality. So I would imagine it's no good. Also, it's very weird that it's labeled as a JRPG and an idler, which you would think those two tags alone should raise some red flags, when pretty obviously this is a visual novel. Which, yeah, as much as I hate to suggest the large language module AI being used, it would be extremely helpful, I think, if Valve created an AI detection system that took different pictures and generated certain tags from them, and then red flagged games that had tags that just don't really feel like they match the screenshots uploaded. Although inherently it would also probably be better if they just had a lot tighter controls of the tags in general, like cartoon here and anime being used as tags, when this is not really what I would call anime, is an example of that. Suppose you could flag tags. What does that do? Tags that reach a certain threshold of reports are removed from this product. That's what that does. Of course, I haven't played the game, so there might actually be JRPG elements for all I know. And more than likely, if this game is going to be taken down or affected on Steam at all, it's just going to be taken down in general. So, not very good system as far as catching things before people flag things, which I imagine very few people actually flag things. Particularly since all it's going to do is remove the tag. And that's another game that the title alone should probably be curated away, because any game with incestuous in the name or incest in the name is going to potentially be YouTube family unfriendly. So should be careful about that. I don't know why that game had the buttons a little bit lower. ME is the developer, ME is the publisher, and he has published several low after game. Here you have an adult game that, again, should have been censored, but it has a censored version of it, putting them in latex outfits, which barely changes anything. Here we have a game that looks actually very interesting, but is mostly negative at 38%, which I really have to assume it just runs terribly. Combat is terribly stiff, there's no fluidity between light and heavy attacks. Takes a lot of time to get used to. Game feels super rough around the edges. That's always a shame. I can't help but assume that there are several companies that get 20% of the way through with a game and they just don't have any more funding to polish the animations and the movement and the controls, and then those kinds of games either get abandoned or on rare occasion get shoved out on Steam. But yeah, I'm not going to make a YouTube short on something that's mostly negative already. Here we have another visual novel that feels like it might very well be something that would have an adult's, yep, DLC of some sort. Overall, if the visual novels themselves are actually decent, I don't think I'm gonna say yes to this one either. Them being in censored forms with free uncensored patches or DLC, even paid uncensored patches, is probably the better way for things to go on Steam than hiding it behind an adult section that nobody will ever see. I'm gonna give this a chance. But yeah, that heavily centers around the visual novels themselves being decent to start with, which I don't think those tend to actually be good quality games. This is a different art style, and that's always intriguing to see. I would like to see more variety in art styles. In particular, the Western animation styles are fairly varied, but none of them tend to be consistent enough that you see it happen more than once. We have another mixed reviewed game. I almost want to say yes, but then the screenshots are kind of all over the place. You get this one, and then this one, and this one, and then you get like a completely different looking experience there and there, and then there and there. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know how to really fix Western animation other than to say that there should probably be a lot more of it, of the different styles, so it can grow and evolve and eventually become something better. It is just very weird to me when you look at like Nickelodeon cartoons from the 90s and how there's just like completely different styles, and a lot of them are very ugly, but yeah, at least there would have been something to start with there to eventually evolve it. Although, in fairness, I don't think Ren and Stimpy's animation style was ever going to evolve into anything. And instead of that happening, though, it really is still the case that if there are any new Western animators, they have to effectively start over from scratch and develop their own style. That was one of the things I was thinking about that I can say out loud is, if anybody wants to be a content creator, if your kids want to be content creators, while I can heavily say I don't encourage them to be content creators because they're never going to succeed, but they won't listen to that, so it's not worth actually saying that, so you might as well be a supportive person and encourage them anyways. But one thing you can encourage them to do is draw. Be really good at drawing. First, pencil and paper. Second, learning how to make thumbnails, because that is the skill in particular you're going to really need to be a content creator to have any level of success. I can say this from the fact that I don't really have a level of success, and I also don't have any ability to draw at all. Other things you can do is learn learn what games are really about inherently. Learn how to be an actual critic. Have kids, if you're going to encourage them to play a game, and then make them write a review of the game out and give you an actual report. Too often I see content creators that are just sitting in silence while playing the game, or just making inane, pointless sounds, not any commentary at all, and in that they have no real personality and no criticism to offer. And unfortunately for a small few people that has worked, but that has led to a lot of other people thinking they can be content creators when they don't have an opinion themselves. Hey, this is weird to have anime girls find a difference. I don't think I've seen those two genres compared, mixed together before, and inherently it might be a little distracting as far as find the difference type games go. Learning audio certainly is also helpful for content creators. Learn how to edit audio and edit video at the bare minimum and use that software. I would also say programming to some level will make some sense, at least a Python class. That way you better understand the underlinings of how video games work if you're going to be a video game content creator. On that, I also would say learn mathematics, because mathematics in particular for programming is actually fairly helpful. Higher level mathematics in particular, where you're doing more than just solving for x, but you're actually thinking about how can I make different permutations of something, or what does this symbol actually mean. At a certain level, as a programmer person, a person who likes to program, I kind of wish mathematics would change how they write formulas, which they do it with a lot of Latin symbols and things like that, which mathematics professors are probably familiar with that. But in reality, if they change that down to just Python code, it would be the same statement, but it would be written in a way that is easier to understand by far for your average person. If I had personally learned more mathematics myself, I wouldn't be having as much trouble figuring out how to express what I'm actually trying to accomplish in making a clock app that has the text screen and shrink and expand when you move the window resolution. And I guess the other thing I would say is learn to collaborate and deal with people. Group projects, definitely a thing, because inherently there's just a massive amount of people who became somewhat successful as content creators, for it only to be revealed that they are absolute horrible people who don't know or don't act appropriately around other people. And that is just a level of success that I think everybody's going to need, is that you don't want any skeletons in your closet, or even just general awkwardness in how you deal with people, or a lack of ability to deal with people, in the sense that you can't find collaborators or talk to other people. Of course, I'd also say, if you're going to become a content creator, don't... Yes, here's one that should be in the adult section, I would say. Don't make a channel that is specifically designed around hanging out with your friend, because almost every successful content creator that did make a channel where you're hanging out with a specific friend, eventually, after a while, ends up having one of the friends leave the project, and then there's just some weirdness around that. Game Grumps is an example of that. Super Beer, the Completionist is an example of that. And I was gonna say somebody else was an example of that, but weirdly in that one it was slightly different. The Angry Video Game Nerd, also kind of an example of that, but didn't suffer, I think, too much. But there is definitely an argument that the quality of content has changed since the friendship was less established with Angry Video Game Nerd. Anyways, that's going to be it for this stream. As always, I ask you to like, share, subscribe, comment, and keep on watching. Thanks.